The night still smelled heavily of expensive champagne and cheap, lingering perfume when Ambrose Blackwell slipped quietly through the heavy mahogany door of his Manhattan penthouse apartment. He truly thought the city was still asleep, bathed in the quiet hum of the early morning hours. But he didn't realize the massive storm that was currently waiting for him inside his own home. His silk tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His dark hair was stylishly tousled, and his lips were still wet from the passionate kisses of another woman. He had spent the entire night proudly flaunting his young mistress in public, absolutely believing that his pregnant wife, Jacqueline, was entirely too weak, too naive, and far too fragile to ever challenge his authority. He genuinely thought she would just cry in silence, swallow her daily humiliation, and keep carrying his unborn child without a single word of complaint. But Ambrose was entirely wrong, because while he was busy sipping exorbitantly expensive wine in dim, secluded hotel rooms, Jacqueline had been wide awake. She had spent the dark hours of the night holding her growing belly with one hand and tightly gripping a thick stack of legal documents with the other. She was completely tired of playing the role of the quiet, obedient wife. She was thoroughly exhausted from pretending that everything was perfectly fine while her arrogant husband paraded another woman through Manhattan's most exclusive nightclubs. Her heart had been broken too many times to count. But this time, something fundamental had shifted. It was different now. This time, she wasn't standing alone in the dark. When the antique grandfather clock struck 10 that morning, Ambrose casually walked into the Grand Lounge, expecting what he thought was just a routine family breakfast. The Blackwell family often gathered on Sundays in the sprawling lounge of the penthouse. The opulent place gleamed with polished Italian marble floors, heavy golden chandeliers that caught the morning sun, and the distinct, cold smell of generational money. Ambrose fully expected the usual, boring routine. He expected his wife to be sitting silently and submissively, his mother to be gossiping about high society, and his father to be loudly boasting about his latest ruthless business deals. But today, the scene before him was entirely unrecognizable. Jacqueline was not dressed in her usual, understated pale dresses, nor was she trembling in the corner of the room like a forgotten shadow. She was sitting incredibly tall, her posture perfect, her 6-month pregnant belly clearly visible beneath a sharp, beautifully tailored navy dress. And seated directly beside her, with an open leather briefcase and a pair of sharp, intimidating glasses glinting under the bright morning light, sat Evelyn Carter. Evelyn was widely known as one of the city's most ruthless, bloodthirsty divorce lawyers. Ambrose completely froze in his tracks. His signature, arrogant smirk violently faltered. The warm skin of his face drained entirely of color. Because in that single, agonizing moment, Ambrose inherently knew the truth. The manipulative, game he thought he so masterfully controlled was about to entirely collapse. Around him, the tension in the grand room was absolutely suffocating. His wealthy parents shifted uneasily in their plush seats, immediately sensing that something highly unusual and dangerous was unfolding. His mistress, Cassandra, who had foolishly and brazenly followed him into the family gathering with shameless confidence, twirled her hair around her finger and smiled as if she were already crowned the new queen of the Blackwell Empire. But when Evelyn Carter slowly lifted her chin and began to spread a thick, damning file of printed photographs across the polished mahogany table, a heavy silence completely swallowed the air in the room. There were hotel receipts, explicit pictures, and printed text messages. Every single lie Ambrose had effortlessly told, every secret late-night meeting, every sickening betrayal, was all laid completely bare in undeniable ink and paper. Ambrose's mouth opened to speak, to defend himself, but absolutely no sound came out. He frantically reached for his crystal glass of water, but his hand trembled so violently he had to pull it back. His father's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. His mother gasped audibly, covering her mouth with her hand. And Jacqueline finally spoke. Her voice was incredibly low, but it was as steady as a beating drum. After what you did last night, Ambrose, you left me absolutely no choice. You thought I would just break and fade away. But today, I brought the law with me. Ambrose's mistress let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh, desperately hoping to break the tension, but absolutely no one joined her. The sheer, crushing weight of Jacqueline's words pressed heavily on every single corner of the expansive room. The arrogant husband, who once strutted proudly through gala halls while being showered with endless applause, now sat completely pale and physically shrinking in his own living room. And this was only just the beginning. Because Jacqueline wasn't sitting here today to beg for his attention. She wasn't here to cry over his infidelities. She wasn't even here to fight for his broken love anymore. She was here to completely end it. She was here to end the humiliating parade, the constant betrayal, and the public humiliation, and to finally reclaim the power he had so callously stolen from her. The air in the room thickened uncomfortably. The silence grew sharper, cutting like a knife. All eyes slowly turned to Ambrose, waiting eagerly for his response. But Ambrose, the great corporate titan who had once confidently commanded boardrooms and effortlessly silenced his business rivals with a single, icy glare, could not even find his words. His lips parted slightly, but the absolute only thing he managed to produce was a hoarse, pathetic whisper. "Jacqueline, what on earth are you doing?" Her answer cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "Taking back my dignity." The room practically shook as Evelyn Carter confidently slid the thick stack of divorce papers directly across the table. And Ambrose realized, for the very first time in his privileged life, that he was about to lose absolutely everything. Jacqueline Mitchell Blackwell never, ever thought her life would eventually turn into a sad, cautionary tale whispered over elite coffee tables. At 29 years old, she should have been glowing brightly with maternal joy, happily preparing the nursery for the arrival of her first child, and savoring the deep security of a marriage built on a foundation of true love. But instead of joy, she was carrying the suffocating weight of ultimate betrayal while simultaneously carrying the fragile life of her unborn son. Her story had always looked exactly like a perfect fairy tale from the outside. Looking in, she was a simple, small-town girl who had grown up in upstate New York. She was raised in a modest, warm home with loving parents who deeply believed in the value of hard work and human dignity above all else. Her mother was a dedicated public school teacher. Her father was a hard-working mechanic, with grease perpetually stained on his hands. They didn't have vast, generational wealth, but they possessed deep, unshakable values, honesty, perseverance, and fierce loyalty. Jacqueline grew up wholeheartedly believing in those specific virtues. She grew up believing that true love meant forever, and that spoken promises actually meant something sacred. That unwavering belief was exactly what made her fall so hard for Ambrose Blackwell in the very first place. Ambrose wasn't just any ordinary man. He was the golden son of one of Manhattan's most powerful, elite real estate families. He was incredibly magnetic, fiercely ambitious, and carried himself as a man who seemed to inherently know exactly how to bend the entire world to his will. When Jacqueline first met him at a crowded charity fundraiser during her university years, she was instantly struck by his overwhelming confidence. He had an uncanny way of making the entire room turn toward him whenever he spoke, acting exactly as if he carried his own gravitational pull. To a young Jacqueline, he seemed completely larger than life. But more importantly, he also looked at her differently than anyone else ever had before. At least, that is exactly what she foolishly believed at the time. He smoothly told her she was incredibly special, totally unique, and vastly unlike the shallow, superficial women he was constantly surrounded by in his high society world. For a girl coming from such a humble, grounded background, those intoxicating words pierced straight into her trusting heart. 6 whirlwind months later, she was wearing a massive, flawless diamond ring. Their wedding was the exact kind of opulent spectacle that glossy society magazines absolutely loved to feature on their covers. It was a luxury ceremony, held at the iconic Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers glittered blindingly above them. Classical violins echoed beautifully through the grand halls, and aggressive paparazzi flashed their cameras outside the doors. Jacqueline, dressed in a custom lace gown that seemed spun directly from dreams, truly thought she was stepping into her happily ever after. The wealthy guests whispered behind their champagne flutes that she was incredibly lucky, that she had somehow managed to capture Manhattan's most eligible rising star. But Jacqueline honestly thought Ambrose was the lucky one. simply because she was entirely willing to give him her entire, devoted heart. But she gave up significantly more than just her heart to him. She gave up her life's dreams. Before marrying into the Blackwell family, Jacqueline had been well on her way to building a highly successful career in interior design. She absolutely loved architecture and was fascinated by the unique way physical spaces could tell beautiful stories. She had studied tirelessly in college, sketched complex designs late through the night, and constantly dreamed of opening her very own independent design studio one day. But Ambrose quickly made it known that he wanted her to play an entirely different role for him. He wanted the devoted, traditional wife, the quiet, beautiful supporter, the elegant woman who stayed perfectly composed in the background while he aggressively climbed toward absolute corporate power. At first, she genuinely didn't mind the shift. She naively thought that was exactly what true love was, willing sacrifice. She thought their marriage partnership meant that his grand dreams were now her dreams, too. So, she quietly left her personal ambitions behind, turned her entire focus to supporting his skyrocketing career, and built their new life together completely in his shadow. But living in the shadows is incredibly cold. Slowly but surely, Jacqueline began to realize she was entirely fading away. Her days were suddenly filled with a deafening silence inside the massive penthouse. While Ambrose supposedly worked late nights at the office, his phone would constantly buzz on the counter with hidden messages he absolutely didn't want her to see. He became increasingly more distant, more irritable, and highly impatient with her. When she finally found out she was pregnant, she desperately thought it would magically change things between them. She thought impending fatherhood would soften his hard edges and bring him much closer to her again. For a very brief, fleeting moment, she even believed it actually had. He happily kissed her growing belly, whispered sweet promises into her ear, and told her she was the absolute love of his life. But that fragile illusion violently shattered into a million pieces the exact night she caught the faint, undeniable trace of another woman's sweet perfume lingering heavily on his suit jacket. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It rapidly became a careless, toxic pattern. Vicious rumors began to quickly circle among Manhattan's elite socialites. There were hushed whispers of Ambrose being seen at late night, intimate dinners, smoothly slipping into boutique hotels, and openly entertaining other women at exclusive galas while a pregnant Jacqueline stayed home alone. She bravely asked him about it, confronting him with the rumors, but his answers were always incredibly sharp, cruel, and highly dismissive. "Don't be so ridiculously paranoid," he snapped at her angrily. "You really should just focus on the health of the baby, not on pathetic, jealous gossip." Her heart broke into pieces, but she stayed. She stayed because she desperately thought their love could still somehow be salvaged. She stayed because she firmly thought their unborn child deserved to have a whole, unbroken family. But When Ambrose completely stopped coming home at night, when she regularly found bright red lipstick smudges stained on his white collars, when he didn't even bother to try and hide his affairs anymore, she finally knew the absolute truth. She wasn't a beloved wife to him anymore. She was just an inconvenient obstacle in his life. And yet, Jacqueline was absolutely not as weak or as fragile as Ambrose foolishly thought she was. Her quiet demeanor was not a sign of surrender. Her endless tears were absolutely not the end of her story. Somewhere incredibly deep inside her soul, the core values her parents had raised her with: dignity, perseverance, and immense courage began to aggressively resurface. She finally realized that staying silent and accepting the abuse was no longer an option. Her innocent baby deserved a strong mother who stood incredibly tall, not a broken woman who constantly bowed to daily humiliation. So, she quietly began to prepare for war. While Ambrose arrogantly thought she was far too broken and depressed to resist him, Jacqueline was secretly meeting with top-tier lawyers in the city. She found Evelyn Carter, a brilliant woman, widely known for her iron will, her razor-sharp intellect, and her unshakable, terrifying presence in a courtroom. Evelyn didn't just look across the desk and see a heartbroken, pregnant wife. She clearly saw a fierce fighter waiting to be unleashed. Together, they meticulously built a flawless plan. It was a plan not just to simply pack up and leave Ambrose quietly, but to violently confront him in the absolute one way he never, ever expected, publicly and directly in front of the very people he valued significantly more than his own wife's happiness. Jacqueline spent countless sleepless nights carefully collecting hard evidence, downloading bank statements, and thoroughly documenting every single betrayal and every lie. She bravely carried her growing baby with one hand and her absolute dignity with the other, patiently waiting for the exact moment when she would finally stand face to face with Ambrose, no longer acting as the obedient, blind wife, but as the powerful woman ready to end the humiliating parade. And that highly anticipated moment had finally come. Because when Ambrose swaggered into the family gathering that Sunday morning, fresh off a night with his mistress, he honestly thought he was still completely untouchable. But Jacqueline was absolutely no longer the timid woman he remembered marrying. She was infinitely stronger, significantly sharper, and she was absolutely no longer afraid of him. And when her fiery eyes locked directly with his across the massive room, Ambrose felt it in his bones. This was absolutely not the same Jacqueline he had married. This was the fierce Jacqueline who had finally come to utterly destroy his kingdom of lies. The Blackwell penthouse was never truly a home. It was a sterile, imposing fortress of unimaginable wealth, a towering monument to absolute power, and a glittering stage explicitly built for maintaining high society appearances. Perched aggressively high above the bustling streets of Manhattan, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered sweeping, panoramic views of the entire city. There were endless, glittering lights, sprawling avenues stretching for miles, and the dark Hudson River flowing like liquid silver far beneath the iconic skyline. But inside those walls, the air was significantly colder than the massive steel beams that held the skyscraper together. This was exactly where Ambrose Blackwell lived, worked, and ruthlessly played his games. To him, the massive penthouse was undeniable, physical proof that he had unequivocally won the grand game of life. Every single imported marble tile, every dripping golden chandelier, every custom leather armchair shipped directly from Italy quietly whispered a tale of financial victory. He absolutely loved hosting important guests here, wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and flashy celebrities. It was a designated place where he could effortlessly show off his massive influence, where fake, booming laughter clinked harmoniously with crystal champagne flutes, and where multi-million-dollar deals were casually signed with the simple stroke of a luxury pen. But to Jacqueline, the sprawling penthouse had always felt exactly like a gilded cage. When she very first moved in immediately after their wedding, she tried incredibly hard to convince herself it was a magical place. She marveled endlessly at the floating spiral staircase, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the massive private terrace that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of Central Park. Her old friends from her small hometown audibly gasped in jealousy when she sent them pictures of the views. They constantly told her she was the luckiest girl in the world. But the much longer she actually lived there, the more she slowly realized the depressing truth. The pristine walls were entirely too high. The echoing rooms were far too wide, and the daily silence inside them was incredibly, suffocatingly heavy. Ambrose had eagerly filled the entire penthouse with absolutely everything dirty money could buy, but he purposefully left absolutely no space for genuine human warmth. The recycled air inside always smelled faintly of expensive designer cologne and printer ink, but it never, ever smelled of warm, home-cooked meals or fresh, vibrant flowers. Even when Jacqueline desperately tried to decorate the sterile space with her own personal touch, adding soft, flowing curtains, framed personal photos, and vases of bright, simple daisies, Ambrose harshly brushed her efforts aside, coldly stating that her taste made the expensive place look incredibly cheap and pedestrian. The penthouse eventually became a perfect reflection of his soul, grand, freezing cold, and profoundly lonely. It was also the agonizing backdrop of her absolute worst, most degrading humiliations. She vividly remembered the countless, agonizing nights she spent waiting anxiously by the massive window, watching the headlights of cars approach far below, desperately hoping it was Ambrose finally coming home to her. Instead, long, quiet hours passed, and when he finally did stumble through the door, he reeked overwhelmingly of hard liquor and cheap perfume. She remembered the lavish, catered dinner parties where she was forced to sit silently at the far, isolated end of the long dining table, her polite smile completely forced. While Ambrose effortlessly charmed their wealthy guests and actively ignored her existence. The penthouse was always filled to the brim with loud laughter, but absolutely none of it was ever hers. Now, that exact same luxurious penthouse was about to violently become something else entirely. It was becoming a courtroom. When Jacqueline had bravely told Evelyn Carter her ultimate plan, the seasoned lawyer had nodded sharply in fierce approval. Make him completely face it right here, directly in his own safe sanctuary. That is exactly where the fall from grace will sting him the absolute most. So, it was strategically decided. The final family meeting would take place right in the grand lounge of the Blackwell penthouse. The massive room was the undeniable beating heart of his empire. It was an imposing space lined floor to ceiling with dark oak shelves, heavily filled with rare, expensive books that absolutely no one ever bothered to read. It featured a massive, roaring fireplace carved entirely from a single block of Italian marble, and an enormous, oval dining table polished so incredibly bright that it literally reflected their faces like a dark mirror. At the very center of that table usually sat Ambrose, holding court, with Jacqueline placed quietly and submissively at his side. But this morning, the seating arrangement was entirely, dangerously different. Jacqueline sat firmly and proudly at the absolute head of the table. Evelyn Carter sat directly beside her like a loaded weapon, her legal papers neatly stacked, an expensive pen in her hand, and her facial expression as sharp and unforgiving as a razor blade. Across from them, Ambrose's wealthy parents shifted incredibly uneasily in their plush leather seats. Harold Blackwell, Ambrose's intimidating father, was a ruthless man of iron-gray hair and an even more ironclad temper. He had aggressively built the massive family fortune through years of ruthless, cutthroat real estate acquisitions, and he utterly despised any form of weakness in any person. Right next to him sat Margaret Blackwell, a fragile woman heavily draped in expensive pearls and lifelong silence, her anxious gaze darting nervously around the room as though she were frantically scanning the perimeter for a safe escape route. And then there was Cassandra. Ambrose had been incredibly, unbelievably reckless enough to actually bring his young mistress right into the lion's den. Cassandra Monroe, who was barely 25 years old, with bright red lipstick smeared across her mouth like a defiant flag of victory, sat incredibly smugly right at Ambrose's side. She wore a tight, revealing designer dress that clung aggressively to her every curve, providing a deliberate, trashy contrast to Jacqueline's modest, refined elegance. Her eyes flickered wildly with arrogance and triumph, acting exactly as if she firmly believed she had already won the ultimate prize. The heavy atmosphere in the grand lounge was completely suffocating. The tiny clinking of a silver spoon against a porcelain teacup echoed entirely too loudly. Off the walls, the slow, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock seemed to scrape agonizingly against every single exposed nerve in the room. Even the bustling city outside the glass, usually roaring with loud car horns and wailing sirens, seemed to suddenly hush in terrifying anticipation. Jacqueline sat perfectly still, but her heart was pounding a frantic, chaotic rhythm against her ribs. She gently rested her hand on her pregnant belly, desperately steadying her nerves with the quiet, reassuring rhythm of the tiny life growing inside her. She wasn't just fighting a battle for herself today. She was actively fighting for her child's entire future. When Ambrose finally strolled casually into the room, fashionably late, as he always was, his arrogant swagger seemed to fill the entire space. His expensive tuxedo jacket was slightly wrinkled from the night before, and his dark hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he had been aggressively celebrating rather than actually sleeping. He looked exactly like a man who had zero cares in the world. His trademark smirk widened considerably when he saw Cassandra already seated comfortably at the table. He leaned down and kissed her hand incredibly boldly, acting exactly as if he were intentionally daring Jacqueline to have an emotional reaction. But then, his dark eyes finally met Jacqueline's across the long table. Something fundamental in the air immediately shifted. She was absolutely no longer the fragile, weeping woman he had grown so incredibly used to casually ignoring. Her back was ramrod straight. Her eyes were crystal clear and burning with fire. Her entire presence was commanding, and the intimidating woman seated directly beside her, Evelyn Carter, with her freezing cold stare and her thick, ominous legal file, sent an immediate, terrifying chill right down his spine. Ambrose faltered physically, just slightly, but it was more than enough to show his sudden fear. "Jacqueline," he said smoothly, desperately trying to recover his footing. "You look noticeably different today." "I am different," she replied instantly, her voice perfectly steady, cutting cleanly through the thick silence like shattered glass. Every single pair of eyes in the massive room turned sharply toward her. The crushing weight of their history, the agonizing betrayal, and the shifting dynamics of power pressed heavily into the cold space between them. This was the glorious house Ambrose had built. This was the massive empire he arrogantly believed was entirely unshakable. But Jacqueline had brilliantly transformed it into the ultimate stage for his spectacular downfall. The sprawling city lights glimmered weakly outside the windows like 1,000 watchful, judgmental eyes, almost as if the entirety of New York itself was eagerly waiting to see exactly what would unfold. The crystal chandeliers glittered brightly above them. The marble floor gleamed immaculately below them. And in that vast, echoing room of unimaginable wealth and toxic silence, the very air crackled with electric tension. For agonizing years, Jacqueline had been nothing more than a sad, invisible ghost wandering the halls of this penthouse. But today, she was the raging fire. And when Evelyn Carter slowly, deliberately snapped open her leather briefcase, the very first damning document sliding smoothly across the polished table, Absolutely everyone in that cold, glittering room suddenly realized that the brutal battle for the soul of the Blackwell Empire had just officially begun. Ambrose Blackwell was exactly the kind of powerful man people either desperately envied or utterly feared. In Manhattan's highly exclusive, elite circles, his name carried massive, undeniable weight. He was known for being entirely ruthless in business deals, incredibly charming at high society parties, and deeply arrogant in absolutely every single way that massive power usually allows. People frequently said he could smoothly talk a skeptical investor into signing away millions of dollars with just a flashing smile. Others warned that he could completely destroy a lifelong business rival's career with just a single, well-placed phone call. For years, Jacqueline had foolishly believed his intense charisma was purely magnetic, but she now clearly saw exactly what dark void lay hidden beneath it. Bottomless greed, pathetic vanity, and a sick hunger for validation that could absolutely never be fully satisfied. Ambrose thrived entirely on maintaining appearances. He drove only the rarest, most expensive sports cars, exclusively wore custom-tailored Italian suits, and routinely dined in highly exclusive restaurants where the exorbitant bill for two people could easily buy a struggling family a month's rent. To him, his entire life was just an elaborate performance, and he firmly believed he was always meant to play the starring lead role. He honestly believed he was completely untouchable, that absolutely no one on earth could ever expose his hidden weaknesses, especially not Jacqueline, the quiet, compliant wife he had successfully pushed so far into the background she was practically invisible. But the absolute truth of the matter was incredibly simple. Behind the sharp, expensive tuxedos and the perfectly polished Italian leather shoes, Ambrose was nothing but a pathetic coward when directly confronted with his bad behavior. He just laughed it off defensively. When he was caught red-handed, he lied through his teeth. And when he felt truly cornered, he viciously attacked. For him, immense power wasn't just about winning in business. It was entirely about having total control. He demanded absolute control over his wealthy investors, strict control over his terrified employees, and worst of all, complete psychological control over his wife. He arrogantly believed Jacqueline would absolutely never leave him. She was heavily pregnant, completely financially tied to his wealth, and entirely socially dependent on the power of his famous last name. In his twisted mind, she had absolutely no viable route of escape. And then, there was Cassandra. Cassandra Monroe was absolutely everything Ambrose foolishly thought he wanted in a woman. She was 25, undeniably beautiful, incredibly bold, and utterly shameless. She had originally been a junior marketing associate working at one of his many subsidiary companies. Ambrose first noticed her at a lavish corporate gala, where she wore a plunging scarlet designer gown and laughed just a little too loudly at all of his mediocre jokes. She knew exactly how to Play the game to win. She used the wide, admiring eyes, the constant, flattering words, and the calculated way her hand lingered just a second too long on his arm. Ambrose, who was already deeply bored of Jacqueline's quiet, dignified grace, was instantly captivated by Cassandra's reckless fire. At first, she was incredibly discreet about the affair. A late night, private dinner here, a weekend business trip there, a luxury hotel suite booked safely, under a fake corporate name. But very soon, her forced discretion metastasized into blatant arrogance. Cassandra absolutely wasn't satisfied with just being a dirty little secret in the dark. She desperately wanted public recognition, expensive jewels, and the blinding spotlight. She wanted to be heavily photographed by the paparazzi on Ambrose's arm. She wanted the entire elite world to whisper her name with envy. And Ambrose, completely intoxicated by her youthful energy and endless flattery, gladly gave in to her demands. He began to brazenly flaunt her at highly exclusive, members-only clubs. He proudly brought her to elite, $1 million art auctions. He even had the sheer, disrespectful audacity to take her to the Metropolitan Opera, where half the city's elite watched them and whispered viciously behind their velvet programs, all while his pregnant wife stayed home, alone in the dark. Each and every time he got away with it, he convinced himself even more that he was totally untouchable. He genuinely thought Jacqueline would just silently endure the public humiliation because she had absolutely no other choice. Cassandra, on the other hand, absolutely thrived on Jacqueline's forced silence. To her twisted mind, every single tear Jacqueline shed alone in the penthouse was concrete proof of her own grand victory. Every single time Ambrose chose to ignore his wife to spend time with her, Cassandra felt a massive rush of power, feeling exactly like she had won the ultimate prize. She routinely strutted right into the penthouse with her red lipstick-stained smile, acting exactly as if she were already crowned the brand new Mrs. Blackwell. But hiding beneath Cassandra's bubbly confidence was something infinitely more dangerous, pure, unadulterated ambition. She absolutely wasn't just after Ambrose's physical affection or his expensive gifts. She was actively after his entire empire. She constantly whispered poison into his ear in bed about aggressively expanding his business, strongly advised him to ruthlessly cut off his loyal, old partners, and constantly encouraged him to take significantly bigger, more dangerous financial risks. To a blinded Ambrose, she seemed exactly like a supportive partner who deeply believed in his grand vision. In truth, Cassandra believed absolutely only in herself. She keenly knew that if Jacqueline were finally, permanently pushed aside, she would effortlessly gain not just Ambrose's famous name, but also his immense wealth, his properties, and his global influence. That was exactly why, on the fateful morning of the family meeting, Cassandra walked into the penthouse lounge with her head held incredibly high. She Genuinely thought this was the exact moment she would finally be legitimized to. The family. She thought Ambrose would finally, proudly make it clear to absolutely everyone in the room. Jacqueline was officially finished. And Cassandra was the glorious future. But Cassandra had massively, fatally underestimated one crucial thing. She severely underestimated Jacqueline. As Evelyn Carter began to methodically spread the damning evidence across the polished table, Cassandra's arrogant smile violently flickered. The high-resolution photos of luxury hotel receipts, the printed transcripts of explicit texts Ambrose had sent her in the middle of the night, the massive, itemized credit card bills, they weren't just highly embarrassing. They were legally, undeniably damning. Cassandra leaned urgently closer to Ambrose, her manicured hand tightening fiercely on his arm, her sharp red nails literally digging painfully into his skin. "Do something to stop this," she hissed desperately under her breath. But Ambrose could physically feel the burning heat of every single eye in the room locked directly onto him. His powerful father's intense glare burned right through him with absolute, unmasked disappointment. His mother's wide eyes brimmed with profound, overwhelming shame. Evelyn's incredibly sharp, calculating gaze pinned him to his chair exactly like a predator cornering its prey. And Jacqueline wasn't trembling in fear or begging for his love. She was incredibly calm. She was terrifyingly strong. For the very first time in his entire, privileged life, Ambrose actually felt completely cornered. He desperately tried to laugh the situation off, falling back on his usual charm. "Really, Jacqueline? Is this honestly what it's come to? Dragging a blood-sucking lawyer into our private family breakfast? Do you really want to publicly humiliate me like this?" Her reply was incredibly simple and devastatingly cold. "No, Ambrose. You humiliated yourself." Cassandra's smugness finally, completely faltered. She had fully expected Jacqueline to crumble into a weeping mess. But instead, she was magnificently rising to the occasion. The entire room's energy was violently shifting. For the very first time, Cassandra was hit with the terrifying realization that being Ambrose's mistress might not actually secure her a wealthy future. It might completely, utterly destroy her right along with him. Ambrose, however, simply couldn't see the reality of the situation yet. He was far too blinded by his own massive pride. He violently slammed his heavy hand down flat on the mahogany table, the loud, aggressive sound echoing sharply through the quiet lounge. "I built this entire empire from the ground up," he roared. "Absolutely. Everything you have in your life is entirely because of me. Do you really honestly think you can actually take me down with a few pathetic pieces of paper?" Evelyn Carter leaned aggressively forward, her voice incredibly sharp, calm, and highly deliberate. "These absolutely aren't just pieces of paper, Mr. Blackwell. They are hard, legal evidence. Evidence that will absolutely not only secure Jacqueline's total financial freedom, but also explicitly expose your massive corporate misconduct to the global public. Federal judges absolutely love presiding over cases exactly like this one, especially when they involve an arrogant man publicly flaunting his mistress while his heavily pregnant wife sits at home alone. The absolute silence that fell immediately after her words was deafening. Even Cassandra shifted incredibly uncomfortably in her leather seat, her eyes darting toward the door. Ambrose's defiant smirk finally completely broke into pieces. His arrogant confidence slipped right off his face like a cheap plastic mask violently torn away. For the very first time, the great, untouchable Ambrose Blackwell looked incredibly, pathetically small. But Jacqueline absolutely wasn't finished with him yet. She placed her hand gently but firmly over her swelling belly, her dark gaze perfectly steady. "You really thought I was weak, Ambrose. You thought I would just stay silent and take the abuse. But today, the entire world is going to see the absolute truth." And in that horrifying, freezing instant, Ambrose finally realized that he was absolutely no longer the apex predator in the room. He was the helpless prey. The suffocating silence inside the Blackwell penthouse was absolute. Every single person in the massive room could physically feel the heavy tension pressing violently against their skin, crawling deep into their lungs like thick smoke. Ambrose sat rigidly at the long oak table, his strong jaw clamped tight, his panicked eyes darting frantically back and forth between the damning, explicit photographs and the lawyer's freezing, cold stare. Cassandra clung desperately to his arm, whispering frantically under her breath. But even she couldn't manage to hide the wild flicker of absolute panic shining in her wide eyes. For years, Ambrose had played his designated role absolutely perfectly. He was the highly devoted son, the brilliant, visionary businessman, and the dazzling, charismatic host of Manhattan's most glittering, elite parties. He had meticulously built his public image exactly like a towering skyscraper, floor by careful floor, until the entire city wholeheartedly believed in his absolute invincibility. But right now, sitting in his own luxurious penthouse, the very foundation of that skyscraper was violently cracking, and the people who mattered the most in his world were watching it fall. Harold Blackwell's aging face was carved from pure stone. His deep voice, when it finally broke the silence, was sharp enough to effortlessly slice right through the thick tension in the room. "Is this actually true, Ambrose?" Ambrose swallowed incredibly hard, his throat dry. "Father, I swear, it's absolutely not what it looks like." Margaret Blackwell let out a sudden, trembling gasp, clutching her pearls. "My God, Ambrose, how could you possibly do this to her?" Ambrose's pale cheeks suddenly flushed with hot, defensive rage. He absolutely hated weakness of any kind, and right now, he looked incredibly weak to his father. He stood up abruptly from the table, his heavy chair scraping loudly and violently against the polished marble floor. "This is completely absurd," he shouted defensively. "She's wildly exaggerating everything. She's maliciously using her pregnancy as a shield to get sympathy. Jacqueline, stop this ridiculous nonsense right now before you embarrass yourself any further." But Evelyn Carter was completely unfazed. She was already calmly opening another thick file folder. She confidently slid a massive stack of printed papers across the polished wood toward him. "These are your official hotel records," Evelyn stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "These are exorbitant charges made directly with your corporate credit card. We have undeniable surveillance footage obtained from the Waldorf Astoria and signed room service receipts featuring your exact handwriting. Do you honestly still want to call this nonsense, Mr. Blackwell?" Ambrose's mouth snapped violently shut. His panicked eyes darted down to the scattered documents, instantly recognizing his own distinct signature. His own careless mistake staring back at him. Cassandra stiffened rigidly beside him. She was rapidly realizing that the glamorous, easy ride she had hitched herself to was currently heading straight into a massive, destructive storm. And then came the absolute dagger to the heart. Jacqueline reached calmly into her designer purse and slowly pulled out a slim black cell phone. Her fingers moved with steady, practiced precision as she unlocked the bright screen and pressed play. Through a Bluetooth connection she had set up earlier, a video was instantly projected onto the massive, flat-screen television mounted across the lounge. The entire room gasped in unison. There was Ambrose, caught in brutal, high-definition clarity. He was laughing uproariously with Cassandra at a dimly lit, crowded rooftop bar. His hand was resting intimately high on her bare thigh. His lips were pressed sloppily against her neck, and his arrogant voice was caught clearly on tape bragging loudly to a smirking colleague over the music. "Jacqueline? God, she's so incredibly boring now. She's literally just the mother of my child. Nothing more. Cassandra is the one who actually excites me. She's the real future of this brand." The cruel, degrading words echoed loudly through the quiet room exactly like a fired gunshot. Margaret violently covered her mouth with shaking hands, tears spilling over her cheeks. Harold's fists clenched so tightly against the oak table that his knuckles turned completely white. Evelyn watched the screen coolly, her professional expression entirely unreadable. And Cassandra, caught dead to rights on camera, acting like a cheap accessory, stared blankly at the marble floor, her bright lipstick smile fading completely into ashes. Ambrose lunged desperately forward across the table, fumbling frantically for the television remote. "Turn that damn thing off right now. That video is completely private. It's..." Jacqueline's voice sliced effortlessly right through his blind desperation. "Private? No, Ambrose. When you aggressively humiliate your pregnant wife in public, And when you blatantly bring your mistress right into our home, absolutely nothing is private for you anymore. Her powerful words landed in the room like a deafening thunderclap. Ambrose, completely froze in his tracks, his eyes wide with horror, his impenetrable mask of arrogance finally, completely slipping away. The toxic betrayal wasn't just being whispered about behind closed doors in the Hamptons anymore. It was out in the open air, utterly undeniable, and profoundly humiliating. The arrogant man who had proudly strutted through the city for years, genuinely believing himself to be an untouchable god among men, was currently being stripped completely bare in front of his disappointed parents, his terrified mistress, and the very woman he had vastly underestimated. For Jacqueline, the moment was an intense mixture of both agonizing pain and incredible liberation. Watching the awful video play, hearing her own husband callously dismiss her as if she were absolutely nothing, still burned a hole in her heart. But showing it here, bravely forcing him to face the ugly truth directly in front of witnesses, gave her immense strength. For the very first time in years, she wasn't the sad woman being silenced and pushed into the corner. She was the warrior holding the loaded weapon. Cassandra shifted incredibly nervously in her chair, her hand slowly slipping away from Ambrose's arm. She could physically feel the entire room rapidly turning against him, and by extension, turning violently against her. Her grand plan to happily bask in the warm glow of his power was disintegrating into dust. By the second, she glanced nervously over at Harold, who was currently glaring at her as though she were a disgusting, muddy stain on the pristine Blackwell family name. For the very first time, Cassandra actually wondered if she should have just stayed in her place as a junior associate. Ambrose desperately tried to regain control of the room, but his words stumbled over each other. This is all completely twisted. Jacqueline, you've maliciously manipulated this footage. You're actively trying to ruin my life. No, she said firmly, her voice echoing. You entirely ruined yourself. The crushing weight of her honest words silenced the room once again. Jacqueline's hand rested highly protectively on her swelling belly. Her back perfectly straight, her dark eyes completely unwavering. She absolutely wasn't a victim anymore. She was a general leading the charge. Harold finally spoke again, his deep voice low, rumbling, but incredibly deadly. Ambrose, do you even realize what you've done today? This isn't just about your failed marriage anymore. This is entirely about the Blackwell name. It's about our family business. It's about our global reputation. And you foolishly dragged it all right through the filthy mud for a cheap thrill. Ambrose's handsome face completely crumpled. He had spent his entire miserable life desperately chasing his father's elusive approval, desperate to finally be seen as his powerful equal. Now, in the span of one single morning, he had permanently destroyed it all. Margaret's voice broke into a sob. Jacqueline, darling, I had absolutely no idea he was doing this to you. Jacqueline's fierce eyes softened briefly when she looked at her mother-in-law. She absolutely wasn't here today to punish Margaret. She wasn't even here to seek Harold's validation or approval. She was strictly here to reclaim her own dignity. Ambrose's heavy hand slammed violently against the table again, his sheer desperation spilling out into the open. You can't do this to me, Jacqueline. Think of the baby. Think of absolutely everything I've given you. Her voice suddenly trembled, absolutely not with fear, but with pure, righteous fury. You gave me total betrayal. You gave me endless humiliation. But you absolutely never, ever gave me your respect. And I absolutely will not let my child grow up in a toxic house built entirely on your lies. The profound words hung heavy and thick in the air. Ambrose staggered backward, slightly, exactly as if he had been physically struck in the chest. For once in his life, he couldn't find a clever argument. He couldn't summon an ounce of his weaponized charm. The absolute truth had finally cornered him, and there was absolutely no route of escape. Cassandra leaned back deeply in her leather chair, her utter silence speaking, significantly louder than any desperate defense could. Even she knew she couldn't save him now. Jacqueline looked around the opulent room, her gaze incredibly steady, her powerful presence completely unshakable. You desperately wanted to make a pathetic spectacle out of me, Ambrose. You eagerly wanted to parade your shiny new mistress in front of everyone in town. But today, the spectacle is entirely yours. And exactly as Evelyn Carter confidently lifted the thick divorce papers from the table and placed them directly in front of Ambrose, the entire glittering world he had aggressively built on a foundation of arrogance and deceit began to spectacularly collapse in front of everyone's eyes. The heavy legal documents lay innocently on the polished table, looking exactly like a signed death sentence. The profound silence that immediately followed was almost unbearable. It was incredibly heavy, practically bursting with the crushing weight of every single dirty secret that had just been dragged kicking and screaming into the light. Ambrose simply stared blankly down at the divorce papers, his eyes wide, looking exactly as though they were written in an ancient language he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Cassandra had completely shrunk down into her chair, her once bright, arrogant confidence evaporating like water on a hot stove. Harold's face was completely dark with unmasked paternal disappointment. Margaret's face was buried in her hands with quiet, devastating shame. But Jacqueline was physically trembling. It wasn't outwardly obvious, not in any way that would give Ambrose the sick satisfaction of seeing her break. But deep inside her core, her entire body quaked violently under the immense pressure of the moment. She held her chin incredibly high, her eyes crystal clear, but her heart was pounding so fiercely against her ribs she genuinely feared the unborn child inside her could feel the vibrations. For agonizing months, she had painstakingly gathered her courage. For long, Sleepless weeks she had meticulously plotted with Evelyn, and for endless days she had desperately prayed to any god listening for the sheer strength to successfully see this nightmare through to the end. Now that the explosive moment was finally here, cold reality hit her system with brutal, undeniable force. Her husband had actively, maliciously betrayed her. He had done it publicly and completely shamelessly. And now, even as she proudly claimed her stolen dignity back from him, she suddenly realized the sheer, terrifying enormity of what she was actually doing. She absolutely wasn't just ending a toxic marriage. She was actively ending the entire, comfortable life she thought she had successfully built. Her breath suddenly came in very shallow gasps, her pale hand instinctively clutching her stomach for comfort. Evelyn noticed the shift, leaned incredibly close to her ear, and whispered softly, "You're doing perfectly fine. Just breathe. Don't let him see your fear." Now. But Ambrose, like an animal sensing a shift in the wind, saw something in her eyes. He smirked faintly, his predatory instincts returning as he sensed a tiny moment of weakness, exactly like a starving shark smelling blood in the water. "You really think you're so incredibly strong, Jacqueline?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at you. You're physically shaking. Do you really, honestly think you can survive out there in the real world without me? You're heavily carrying my child, living rent-free in my massive home, spending my hard-earned money, without me to prop you up. You are absolutely nothing." The cruel words hit her exactly like a physical whip across the face. For a terrifying second, her vision completely blurred with unshed tears. She desperately wanted to scream at him, to violently throw the heavy stack of papers entirely across the room, to just collapse onto the floor under the crushing, unbearable humiliation of it all. Her body, already feeling incredibly heavy with the late stages of pregnancy, suddenly felt like an impossible burden to carry. The wasted years of sacrifice, the endless nights she spent waiting up entirely alone, the pure, unconditional love she had blindly poured into this black hole of a marriage, it all came violently crashing back down on her shoulders. Margaret nervously reached a hand out across the table toward her, but Jacqueline immediately pulled away. She absolutely didn't want their pity. She only wanted her strength. Yet, in that terrible, suffocating moment, true strength felt exactly like an impossible illusion. Her racing mind drifted back to her hard-working parents, to the small, warm home she grew up in upstate. She thought of the long nights when her exhausted father fixed broken cars late into the freezing evening, while her dedicated mother sat marking spelling papers by the dim kitchen lamp. They had dreams such significantly bigger, brighter dreams for her life. They had lovingly raised her to deeply believe in true love and in fierce loyalty. What on earth would they say to her right now, seeing their precious daughter sitting trapped in this cold, Marble Palace, brutally betrayed by the very man she had once trusted the absolute most in the world. The hot tears she had fiercely held back for so long dangerously threatened to spill over her lashes. Evelyn touched her arm incredibly gently, a silent reminder to keep breathing. Jacqueline closed her eyes tight for just a fraction of a moment, desperately trying to steady her racing heart. But Ambrose clearly saw the tiny flicker of emotional pain, and he aggressively pressed significantly harder. "Go ahead and sign the damn papers if you really want to," he sneered, arrogantly, leaning back in his chair. "But you'll eventually come crawling right back to me on your knees. You won't last a single month out there without my checkbook. Weak women like you absolutely never do." Cassandra, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, stirred beside him, eager to aggressively regain her lost place in the hierarchy. "He's absolutely right." "Jacqueline," she said, her voice sounding sickly sweet but razor sharp, "you're really just a tired, boring little housewife. You absolutely don't belong in his fast-paced world anymore. Just look at you right now. You're swollen, pathetic, and totally miserable. I am exactly what he needs to succeed. I'm the real future here." The combined, blatant cruelty of their words effortlessly sliced right through Jacqueline's fragile, remaining defenses. Her hand visibly shook now, and she slowly lowered her dark gaze to the polished table. For the very first time that entire morning, she felt completely cornered and utterly defeated. Her heart squeezed agonizingly, exactly as if all her meticulous resolve and careful planning had been for absolutely nothing. Evelyn leaned closer to her again, her voice intense. "Do not let them win this. Not like this. You are stronger than them." But the toxic voices screaming in Jacqueline's own mind were suddenly much louder than Evelyn's gentle encouragement. What if they were actually right? What if she truly couldn't survive on her own? She had absolutely no career left to fall back on, and no independent income of her own. Ambrose entirely controlled the massive bank accounts, the sprawling properties, the investment portfolios, absolutely everything. She had willingly sacrificed far too much of her own identity for him, and now she was left holding almost nothing. How on earth would she afford to raise a child entirely alone in a ruthlessly expensive city like New York? Her hands trembled significantly harder against her lap. The grand room, completely blurred with hot tears. For one deeply terrifying second, she genuinely wanted to just give up and give in. She wanted to let Ambrose win. To let Cassandra laugh at her. To just quietly crumble back into the quiet, obedient, pathetic woman they both thought she was. And Ambrose clearly saw her breaking. His signature smirk returned to his face, infinitely crueler than ever before. He leaned comfortably back in his leather chair, his arrogant confidence rapidly swelling back up to its normal size. "See, everybody," he mocked loudly. "She absolutely can't do it. She simply doesn't have the strength to pull the trigger." Jacqueline's chest tightened so painfully she couldn't draw a breath. Her breathing turned incredibly rapid and shallow. She quickly excused herself, rising very unsteadily from her chair on shaking legs. I just need some air, she murmured, her voice audibly breaking. Evelyn moved quickly to follow her out, but Jacqueline shook her head firmly. She absolutely didn't want any witnesses to her total emotional collapse. She staggered blindly out of the grand lounge and into the massive, wide hallway of the penthouse, the polished marble floor completely blurred beneath her feet. Her pale reflection in the glossy, mirrored walls looked exactly like a terrifying stranger. She stumbled forward and pushed open the door to the nursery. It was the beautiful room she had so lovingly, painstakingly prepared over the last few months. It was painted in incredibly soft, calming creams and pale blues, heavily filled with tiny, folded clothes, expensive baby gear, and incredibly soft stuffed animals. She gripped the hard, wooden edge of the crib so tightly her knuckles turned white, her hot tears finally spilling over her cheeks in a flood. The sheer, overwhelming pain violently racked her chest, her loud sobs completely breaking the sterile silence of the penthouse. For the very first time since this entire nightmare officially began, Jacqueline allowed herself to completely, utterly fall apart. She pressed her sweaty forehead hard against the crib's wooden rail and wept uncontrollably. Why? Why did you do this to me, Ambrose? Why wasn't I ever enough for you? Her hand moved protectively to her belly, physically trembling. How do I possibly raise this innocent child entirely alone? How do I successfully protect him from the world when I feel so completely broken myself? Her weak knees finally buckled entirely, and she sank heavily to the soft, carpeted floor. She clutched her stomach tightly, exactly as though it were her only remaining anchor in a violent storm. The massive, crushing weight of the betrayal was physically suffocating her, and the sheer, terrifying enormity of the unknown future was closing in on her. In the lounge down the hall, Ambrose smirked triumphantly at Evelyn. She's just gone to the other room to cry, exactly like she always does. This is exactly who she is. She's weak. But Evelyn's sharp eyes narrowed dangerously. She had seen countless women in crisis exactly like Jacqueline before. She had seen women who violently broke down, only to aggressively rebuild themselves back significantly stronger than anyone ever expected. She intimately knew that this emotional breakdown was absolutely not the end of the war. It was the necessary spark that would light the powder keg. Back in the quiet nursery, Jacqueline slowly wiped her wet face, staring blankly up at the empty crib. She looked at the tiny, folded clothes, the soft, monogrammed blankets, the expensive stuffed bear sitting with a silk ribbon tied neatly around its neck. She whispered incredibly softly to the child growing inside her. I honestly don't know exactly how I'm going to do this yet, but I promise you, I will fiercely protect you. I absolutely will not let him win. She stood up incredibly slowly, her tears drying tightly on her flushed cheeks. Her reflection in the dark window pane was significantly clearer to her now. She was still physically trembling, still incredibly raw, still deeply hurt. But, shining brightly in her dark eyes, sitting just beneath the layers of pain, something entirely new powerfully flickered to life. It absolutely wasn't surrender. It was pure, unadulterated survival. And as she slowly, deliberately straightened her back, the faint sound of the heavy lounge doors creaking open down the hall told her that someone was coming. To find her. Someone who might hold the key to change absolutely everything. The heavy nursery door creaked open slowly, and Jacqueline instinctively wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. She absolutely didn't want anyone in that house to see her looking like this, completely broken, sitting pathetically on the floor with swollen, red eyes. But the figure that quietly entered the room wasn't Ambrose, and it certainly wasn't Cassandra. It was Evelyn Carter. The fierce lawyer's expensive heels clicked very softly against the hardwood floor as she entered. "Jacqueline," Evelyn said incredibly gently, crouching down gracefully so she was perfectly eye level with her client. "You did incredibly well in there. Do not ever think that your tears mean you have failed. They simply mean you are human." Jacqueline shook her head, her voice breaking with lingering despair. "He's absolutely right, Evelyn. What if I truly can't survive out there without him? He legally controls absolutely everything. The massive bank accounts, the properties, the house. He even paid for this nursery furniture. What do I actually have to my name?" Evelyn's professional expression instantly shifted into something incredibly sharp, predatory, and highly knowing. "You actually have significantly more power than you realize, Jacqueline." Ambrose made one massive, critical, arrogant mistake. One that he absolutely doesn't know you've already discovered. Jacqueline blinked rapidly, her tears pausing in confusion. "What mistake?" Evelyn calmly opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. She handed it directly to Jacqueline, her dark eyes glittering with a quiet, lethal triumph. "Open this." With physically trembling hands, Jacqueline tore the thick envelope open. Inside was a massive set of highly complex legal documents, certified bank statements, corporate ownership certificates, and executed legal property transfers. Her eyes frantically scanned the pages, sheer disbelief completely flooding her tear-stained face. These are all," she gasped, unable to finish the sentence. "These are entirely in my name." Evelyn nodded, a triumphant smirk on her lips. "Correct. Several months ago, Ambrose aggressively tried to hide his most valuable liquid assets in a complex offshore account to avoid taxes and hide them from a potential divorce. He arrogantly thought he was being incredibly clever by transferring his most valuable properties into a dummy shell corporation. But his massive arrogance Betrayed his intellect. He actually used your legal maiden name as the primary corporate cover, foolishly assuming that absolutely no one in his circle would ever look twice at it. That massive, sloppy oversight means that, legally speaking, you are the sole listed owner of absolutely all of those assets. And I assure you, it is currently worth tens of millions of dollars. Jacqueline's breath caught violently in her throat. The entire room seemed to physically tilt on its axis. For agonizing months, she had felt completely, utterly powerless, utterly convinced that Ambrose held absolutely all the winning cards in the deck. But right here, sitting physically in her hands, was undeniable legal proof that the massive financial empire he had tried to secretly hide was already entirely under her legal control. But why on earth didn't he know this would happen? She whispered in shock. Because arrogant men exactly like Ambrose absolutely never bother checking the fine legal details, Evelyn said incredibly coldly. They blindly assume their little wives are far too stupid and blind to ever look at the paperwork they sign. He still genuinely thinks those hidden accounts are completely invisible to the courts. He has absolutely no idea that with one single authorized signature from you today, you can legally freeze all his funds permanently, transfer property ownership, and leave him standing in the street with absolutely nothing. Jacqueline's tears dried up instantly. Her body still shook slightly, but this specific time, it vibrated with something entirely new and intoxicating. Absolute power. For the very first time since her long nightmare had begun, she absolutely wasn't trapped anymore. She wasn't the weak, trembling, pathetic wife he confidently thought she was. She was literally holding the golden key to his total, catastrophic downfall in her hands. The baby suddenly kicked hard inside her belly, almost exactly as if he were sensing the massive shift in her energy. She placed a warm, protective hand firmly on her stomach, whispering fiercely into the quiet room, "We're going to be more than okay." Evelyn smiled a very faint, proud smile. "Significantly better than okay, my dear. You're about to walk out there and show Ambrose Blackwell that the very woman he thought was completely powerless is the exact woman who will permanently end his reign." Jacqueline straightened her spine very slowly, rising gracefully to her feet. The beautiful nursery around her absolutely no longer looked like a gilded cage. It looked exactly like a staging ground for a battlefield, and she was more than ready to fight the war. They returned to the grand lounge together. Ambrose was casually leaning back in his leather chair, laughing bitterly with his father as if he had already won the ultimate victory. Cassandra sat incredibly close to him again, her smug confidence tentatively restored by Jacqueline's brief, emotional retreat from the room. "Ah, there she is," Ambrose sneered loudly as she entered. "Are you finally back from having your little cry? Are you ready to just sign the papers and get this pathetic drama over with?" Jacqueline walked to her seat incredibly calmly, the thick manila envelope gripped firmly in her hand. She sat down, folded her hands neatly on the table before her, and looked Ambrose dead in the eye with absolute zero fear. No, Ambrose, I am officially ready to end this entirely on my own terms. Evelyn smoothly slid the new stack of documents directly into the center of the table. Ambrose frowned deeply, his arrogant curiosity rapidly flickering into genuine unease. What exactly is this? Your absolute biggest mistake, Jacqueline said coldly. Evelyn's sharp voice carried the final, lethal blow across the quiet room. Mr. Blackwell, as of 9 o'clock this morning, Jacqueline is officially, legally, recognized as the sole owner of your 3 sprawling properties in the Hamptons. Your 2 commercial high-rise buildings located downtown, and a heavily diversified offshore account currently containing exactly $36 million. Evelyn smiled a shark-like smile. All of them legally registered strictly under her maiden name, entirely thanks to your incredibly sloppy, arrogant attempts to hide your assets from the IRS and the divorce courts. All the blood instantly, visibly drained from Ambrose's handsome face. He looked sickly pale. That's completely impossible. Check the signatures for yourself, Evelyn said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the top of the papers. Ambrose violently snatched the documents off the table. His hands were visibly, violently trembling as his panicked eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal pages. Each and every single printed line confirmed exactly what Evelyn had just said. His own massive, blinding arrogance had completely betrayed him. The massive assets he foolishly thought were completely untouchable had already slipped right through his greedy fingers and landed safely into Jacqueline's open hands. Cassandra leaned urgently forward in her chair, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Ambrose, is this actually true? He didn't answer her. He literally couldn't. His horrified, deafening silence was significantly louder than any verbal admission of guilt could ever be. Jacqueline's clear voice was incredibly steady, her icy calm absolutely terrifying to witness. You see, Ambrose, while you were far too busy arrogantly parading your cheap mistress all around town, I was actually busy protecting myself. You honestly thought I was weak, but I was meticulously preparing every single lie you told me, every single dollar you tried to illegally hide from me. I quietly collected it all. And now, the grand empire you think you built is entirely mine. Ambrose violently slammed the heavy stack of papers back onto the table. You absolutely cannot legally do this. I already have, Jacqueline said simply, not breaking eye contact. The entire room violently erupted into chaos. Margaret gasped loudly, clutching her chest. Harold leaned intensely forward in his chair, looking at Jacqueline with a very rare, undeniable glimmer of profound respect shining in his cold eyes. Cassandra actively shifted her chair significantly further away from Ambrose, rapidly realizing that his massive empire was actively crumbling to dust, and right along with it went her own glamorous, wealthy future. Ambrose aggressively stood up, his heavy chair toppling violently backward onto the marble floor. His face was completely twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. You actually think you've won this? You think you can just legally humiliate me like this and get away with it? Jacqueline rose to her feet as well. Her pregnant belly was incredibly prominent, but her dark eyes were absolutely unshakable. This isn't about public humiliation, Ambrose. This is about absolute truth. You completely destroyed our sacred marriage. You viciously disrespected me. You disrespected our unborn child. And you spit on absolutely everything I willingly sacrificed for you. And now, you will finally face the severe consequences of your actions. The powerful words echoed loudly through the cavernous lounge, ringing significantly louder and truer than any violent outburst Ambrose had ever made in his life. For the very first time in their entire relationship, it was Jacqueline's voice that carried absolute, undeniable power. Ambrose's fists clenched tightly at his sides. He desperately wanted to shout at her, to strike something, to somehow violently regain total control of the room. But the legal documents sitting on the table explicitly mocked his impotence. His powerful father's intense glare burned a hole right through his ego. His mother's crying tears deeply shamed him. His mistress's sudden, cowardly silence completely betrayed him. And his wife, no, absolutely not his wife anymore, but his ultimate judge and executioner, had just stripped him entirely bare. Cassandra quickly shifted her seat even further away, her hand slipping completely off his arm. She could clearly see exactly where this sinking ship was rapidly heading. Ambrose was going down fast, and she had absolutely no intention of drowning in the icy water with him. Ambrose's chest heaved violently, his voice breaking into a desperate, pathetic roar. You will deeply regret this, Jacqueline. You'll absolutely regret ever crossing me. But Jacqueline didn't even flinch at his hollow threat. She calmly placed her hand on her swelling belly, her voice incredibly calm, cold, and entirely resolute. No, Ambrose. The absolute only regret in this room today is entirely yours. And exactly as the crushing weight of her final words settled permanently over the room, Ambrose finally, terrifyingly realized that the massive empire he genuinely thought was totally unshakable was already actively collapsing around his ears. And it was his quiet, pregnant wife who had masterfully dealt the fatal, final blow. The bright morning after the explosive confrontation in the penthouse. The bustling island of Manhattan felt exactly like an entirely different city to Jacqueline. The massive glass skyscrapers still pierced the gray sky exactly as they always had. The chaotic traffic still roared aggressively down the busy avenues. And the crowded sidewalks still pulsed vibrantly with endless life. But for the very first time in agonizing years, she absolutely wasn't walking through it as Ambrose Blackwell's submissive, quiet wife. She was proudly walking down the street as Jacqueline Mitchell. She was her very own woman. She carried her own name, and she wielded her own immense power. The thick stack of legal papers Evelyn Carter had handed her had completely changed the trajectory of her entire existence. For agonizing months, Jacqueline had lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear, entirely convinced she was permanently trapped inside Ambrose's suffocating shadow. But now, that dark shadow was completely gone. The massive financial empire Ambrose had illegally tried to hide from the courts was now entirely, legally hers, and the humiliating, highly public exposure of his toxic betrayal had permanently shattered the grand illusion of his absolute invincibility among the city's elite. Still, profound victory often came with deep, lingering scars. Late that night, after the movers and lawyers had all finally left the apartment she had rented, Jacqueline sat completely alone in the quiet new nursery, staring blankly at the tiny, empty wooden crib. The massive, rushing adrenaline from the explosive confrontation had finally faded away from her bloodstream, and sheer, bone-deep exhaustion weighed incredibly heavily on her pregnant body. She gently touched her swelling belly, whispering incredibly softly to the innocent child growing within, "We finally made it safely through the storm. But this is just the absolute beginning." She realized deeply. She couldn't just successfully win a legal battle and stop there. She now had to actively, painstakingly rebuild her entire life from the ground up. The very next morning, Evelyn arrived briskly at her new apartment carrying 2 hot cups of coffee and a very sharp, focused look in her dark eyes. "You successfully did it," Evelyn said, handing her a cup. "But now, you desperately need to show the entire watching world exactly who you are. You absolutely can't just merely survive an encounter with Ambrose. Jacqueline, you have to completely surpass him in every way." Jacqueline frowned, feeling overwhelmed. "How exactly do I do that? I've been completely out of the professional world for so long. I gave up my design career for his ego. Honestly, I don't even recognize the tired woman staring back at me in the mirror anymore." Evelyn smiled a deeply knowing, reassuring smile. "Then I suppose it's officially time you meet her again." And so, Jacqueline's magnificent, total transformation officially began. The very first vital step was highly practical, aggressively reclaiming her total financial independence. Evelyn immediately introduced her to a top-tier financial advisor, a brilliant, sharp woman named Claire, who spoke with incredible, calm authority. Working closely together in a high-rise office, they meticulously went through all the massive bank accounts, the commercial properties, and the hidden offshore assets Ambrose had unsuccessfully tried to bury. Claire patiently explained every single complex legal step, expertly guiding Jacqueline in exactly how to aggressively manage and multiply her massive newfound power. For the very first time in her life, Jacqueline saw large numbers not as heavy, controlling chains, but as vital keys to a kingdom. Every single dollar Ambrose had once maliciously used to control her life was now powerful. High-octane fuel. For her ultimate freedom. The highly necessary second step was deeply personal. Jacqueline stood quietly in front of her full-length mirror one evening, staring critically at the woman reflected back at her. Her hair was unkempt and dull. Her eyes looked incredibly tired and bruised, and her body felt incredibly heavy and foreign with pregnancy. But buried deep beneath that profound fatigue was an undeniable, glowing strength. She immediately booked a simple but transformative haircut at a high-end salon, one that beautifully framed her face and instantly restored her lost confidence. She went shopping for high-end maternity clothes that weren't just purely functional, but incredibly elegant and commanding. She bought soft silk, wrap dresses, sharply tailored wool coats, and designer shoes that gave her height without sacrificing her necessary comfort. Each and every single piece of clothing she put on her body was a loud declaration to the world. She was absolutely not a broken woman. She was violently, beautifully reborn. When she confidently walked through the crowded streets of Manhattan after her stunning makeover, heads naturally turned to look at her. And it wasn't because she was the famous Ambrose's wife, but because she naturally radiated something that he had never, ever given her permission to own: absolute authority. The crucial third step was highly emotional. For several weeks, she diligently attended quiet, intensive therapy sessions where she painstakingly unpacked the painful years of psychological gaslighting, the agonizing nights of deep loneliness, and the crushing public humiliation of his betrayal. Her kind therapist constantly reminded her that true strength absolutely wasn't the complete absence of pain. It was the brave, conscious choice to rise up despite it. Each emotional session was exactly like slowly peeling away another thick, heavy layer of toxic shame, until exactly what remained sitting in the chair was absolutely not a tragic victim, but a fierce, battle-tested survivor. The final, glorious step was purely symbolic. Evelyn expertly arranged for Jacqueline to receive an exclusive VIP invitation to attend the annual Bright Futures Gala. It was the exact, highly publicized society event where Ambrose had once arrogantly flaunted Cassandra in public, acting as if his pregnant wife simply didn't even exist. This specific time, Jacqueline absolutely wouldn't be the sad, crying woman, hidden away in a dark apartment. She would boldly walk into that massive, glittering ballroom completely as herself, radiant, heavily pregnant, and completely untouchable by anyone in the room. On the highly anticipated night of the gala, Jacqueline stood quietly in her apartment, staring deeply at her flawless reflection. The designer gown Evelyn had helped her painstakingly choose was a deep, rich emerald green, the exact color of spring renewal and immense strength. It hugged her pregnant belly, incredibly gracefully, magically transforming her physical pregnancy from a perceived vulnerability into a glittering, royal crown. Her dark hair shimmered beautifully under the warm light. Her makeup was incredibly soft but undeniably commanding. "You look incredibly powerful," Evelyn said proudly, standing right behind her. In the mirror, Jacqueline took a massive, deep, centering breath. "I actually feel incredibly powerful." The long limousine ride to the gala venue felt entirely surreal. As the luxury car glided smoothly through the busy streets, Jacqueline quietly watched the vibrant city lights reflect brightly against the tinted windows. This was the exact same massive, intimidating city that had once made her feel incredibly small and insignificant. Tonight, the city would watch her spectacularly rise. When she confidently stepped out of the car and into the massive, crowded ballroom, total silence immediately followed her path. Loud conversations instantly paused mid-sentence. Crystal champagne glasses froze entirely midair. Hushed, scandalous whispers violently erupted across the massive room. "Is that really Jacqueline Blackwell? My God! She looks absolutely incredible. Tonight, did you hear the insane rumors about what happened with Ambrose? They say she legally owns half of his entire empire now. The very same wealthy, elite people who had once cruelly pitted her now stared at her in absolute awe, and some even looked at her in genuine fear. And then, directly across the crowded room, she finally saw him. Ambrose. His custom tuxedo was perfectly tailored. His charming smile was carefully practiced for the cameras, but his panicked eyes completely betrayed his facade. He absolutely hadn't expected her to show up tonight. He certainly hadn't expected her to shine brighter than anyone else in the room. Cassandra was clinging desperately to his arm, but even she looked visibly rattled and insecure. Her cheap, borrowed confidence was absolutely no match for Jacqueline's quiet, consuming fire. For the very first time in the entire history of their marriage, Ambrose looked incredibly, pathetically small, standing in the exact same room as her. Jacqueline proudly lifted her chin high, willingly letting the flashing cameras capture her glow, letting the scandalous whispers grow louder around them. She absolutely didn't even need to walk over and approach him. Her sheer, overwhelming presence in the room was more than enough. She was absolutely no longer defined by his cruel betrayal. She was entirely defined by her spectacular survival. As the live orchestra swelled beautifully and the opulent gala officially resumed, Evelyn leaned in closely toward her ear. "This is only just the beginning for you, Jacqueline. This entire city has seen you tragically fall. Now, it will watch you magnificently rise." Jacqueline smiled, a very faint, knowing smile, her hand resting protectively on her swelling belly. She wasn't just rising for her own ego. She was aggressively rising for the innocent life she safely carried, for the beautiful, safe future she would actively shape completely without Ambrose's toxic influence. And as she stood firmly under the dripping crystal chandeliers, practically glowing with immense strength and undeniable dignity, she inherently knew the long battle wasn't entirely over yet, because very soon she would not only rise far above Ambrose in society, she would publicly confront his crimes and permanently end his reign of terror once and for all. The massive chandeliers glittered blindly above the grand ballroom of the bright Futures Gala, aggressively scattering warm, golden light across clinking crystal, glasses and designer gowns that were worth small fortunes. The city's absolute elite had all gathered together. Their loud, overlapping conversations, a constant, buzzing hum of generational wealth and ruthless ambition. Aggressive. Photographers hovered anxiously near the red carpet entrance, eagerly waiting to capture the night's most powerful, influential arrivals. And then, Jacqueline boldly entered the room. Loud, collective gasps rippled violently through the massive room. Paparazzi. Cameras flashed like a lightning storm, eagerly capturing her deep emerald gown, flowing incredibly gracefully over her pregnant belly. Her posture was impeccable, her shoulders squared with a quiet, undeniable confidence. For agonizing months, she had been nothing more than a favorite subject of cruel, high society whispers. She was the pitifully betrayed wife, the publicly humiliated mother-to-be. But tonight, she walked across the marble as though she had been completely baptized in fire and reborn. Her grand entrance was highly deliberate. Every single, clicking step she took across the polished marble floor was a loud, public declaration of war. She was absolutely no longer hiding in the shadows. Evelyn Carter walked closely beside her, incredibly calm and hyper-watchful, acting as a silent, lethal guardian at her side. Together, they effortlessly drew the stunned eyes of the entire ballroom. Across the crowded room, Ambrose completely froze in his tracks. He had been busily entertaining a tight, wealthy circle of potential new investors. His fake smile was wide and practiced, his hand firmly and possessively gripping Cassandra's tiny waist. For the past several weeks, he had tried desperately to quickly rebuild his tarnished image, loudly insisting to anyone who would listen that the nasty rumors of his betrayal were wildly exaggerated, and that his temporary marriage troubles were an entirely private matter. But the shocking sight of Jacqueline, looking absolutely radiant, powerful, and completely unshaken, instantly shattered his carefully constructed composure into a million pieces. Ambrose, whispered one of the older, wealthy investors, squinting across the room. Isn't that your lovely wife walking in? Ambrose's strong jaw tightened until it ached. Ex-wife, he muttered angrily, under his breath, even though the complicated divorce papers weren't officially finalized yet. Cassandra's tight grip on his arm tightened nervously, her panicked eyes darting frantically toward Jacqueline's imposing figure. The young mistress had fully expected Jacqueline to stay safely hidden away in her apartment, completely broken and depressed. She absolutely hadn't anticipated this reality, a powerful woman completely transformed into a force of nature that severely threatened to eclipse them both. Jacqueline moved effortlessly through the parting crowd, hundreds of heads turning to watch as she passed by. Some wealthy guests whispered in genuine awe of her beauty. others in lingering pity, but absolutely all of them recognized the high-stakes drama that was about to unfold. At the exact, dead center of the ballroom, she stopped walking. A passing waiter quickly offered her a flute of champagne, but she politely waved it away, resting her hand protectively on her stomach instead. Ambrose, feeling entirely forced into action by dozens of curious, watching eyes, aggressively crossed the crowded room to confront her. His fake smile was incredibly strained, his voice dropping to a low, furious hiss. "What the hell do you think you're doing showing up here tonight?" Jacqueline slowly lifted her chin, looking down her nose at him. "Taking back my rightful place in this city." He glanced around frantically at the sea of watching faces, his arrogant mask slipping further. "Don't you dare make a massive scene here." She gave a very soft, almost genuinely amused laugh. "You already made the horrific scene months ago, Ambrose. I'm just here to finally finish it." Evelyn confidently stepped forward, her sharp, authoritative voice carrying incredibly clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive the sudden interruption to your evening. But since so very many of you here tonight are major investors, key business partners, and supposed loyal friends of Mr. Blackwell, you all deeply deserve to know the absolute truth about him." The entire elite crowd leaned in hungrily, their morbid curiosity rapidly sharpening into a ravenous hunger. Manhattan high society absolutely thrived on juicy public scandals, and tonight heavily promised an absolute feast. Evelyn produced a thick, red folder from her sleek evening clutch and held it up. "We have right here, in hand, undeniable documentary evidence of Mr. Blackwell's massive corporate misconduct. He is guilty of the illegal misappropriation of millions in company funds, deeply concealed offshore assets, and most damningly of all, an expensive, sordid affair flaunted publicly while his wife carried his unborn child. He may loudly claim to be a man of high corporate integrity, but these bank records show exactly otherwise." Massive gasps erupted from the crowd. Cell phones instantly rose high into the air, recording the entire spectacle. All the remaining color completely drained from Ambrose's horrified face. "Stop this right now," he hissed frantically at them. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me?" "Yes," Jacqueline said incredibly firmly, her clear voice carrying powerfully across the silent room. "I'm finally showing absolutely everyone in this room who you really are in the dark." Cassandra desperately tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out incredibly brittle and fake. "This is completely ridiculous. Absolutely no one here cares about your pathetic personal drama." Evelyn quickly and loudly cut her off. "This absolutely isn't just personal drama. Ambrose illegally used shared corporate accounts to fund luxury hotel stays, exorbitant designer gifts, and even private first-class flights exclusively for his mistress. That absolutely isn't a personal failing. That is federal corporate fraud." The massive crowd erupted yet again, the shocked whispers rapidly turning into sharp, angry murmurs. Wealthy investors quickly exchanged panicked glances with each other, frantically calculating their impending financial losses in their heads. Hungry reporters who had sneaked and scribbled notes furiously on their pads. Ambrose violently staggered backward, heavy beads of cold sweat forming rapidly on his forehead. "You absolutely won't survive doing this," he muttered desperately to Jacqueline, his voice shaking. "Do you honestly think these people will ever respect you more than they respect me?" Jacqueline's dark eyes blazed with undeniable, righteous fire. "I absolutely don't need their fake respect, Ambrose. I already have my total freedom. And very soon, my innocent child will have a beautiful life completely without you poisoning it." Her powerful words landed on him exactly like a physical slap to the face, the crowd gasping loudly again at the impact. Cell phone cameras zoomed in much closer, eagerly capturing every single pathetic flicker of Ambrose's completely unraveling composure. Cassandra slowly, quietly slipped her hand away from his and backed into the crowd, keenly sensing the massive ship violently sinking beneath her designer heels. Then, Evelyn ruthlessly delivered the absolute, final, fatal blow. She held up a thick, legally signed document, her voice ringing out clear as a bell. "And for those of you in the room who are deeply concerned about your corporate investments, you should know this right now. The majority controlling stake in 3 of Blackwell Holdings' most incredibly valuable downtown properties now rests legally and permanently in Jacqueline Mitchell's name. Ambrose absolutely doesn't control those assets anymore. She does." The entire massive room fell into a stunned, deafening silence. Then came the chaotic murmurs, the rapid shifting of corporate alliances. Major investors literally, physically turned their backs on a sweating Ambrose, moving quickly and respectfully toward Jacqueline's side of the room. Journalists rushed eagerly forward, snapping hundreds of bright photos of her exactly as though she were the absolute, undisputed star of the evening. Ambrose's voice cracked pathetically, his sheer desperation finally spilling out. "You absolutely can't do this to me. You're my wife." Jacqueline stepped significantly closer to him, her hand resting firmly on her stomach, her eyes completely unflinching and cold. "No, Ambrose. I was your loving wife, and you single-handedly destroyed that. Tonight, I'm something infinitely more powerful. I'm the exact woman who permanently ended your reign." The live orchestra, incredibly sensing the massive, cinematic gravity of the moment, struck a highly dramatic, sweeping note. The entire crowd erupted into deafening, spontaneous applause. It absolutely wasn't for Ambrose. It was entirely for Jacqueline. In that glorious, defining instant, she absolutely wasn't a pathetic victim anymore. She was entirely victorious. Ambrose stumbled backward into the crowd, his handsome face sickly pale, his Massive, billion-dollar empire literally crumbling to dust before his very eyes. The flashing cameras caught absolutely all of it. It was the spectacular, public fall of an arrogant man who genuinely thought himself to be a god. Brought down to earth not by his ruthless business rivals, but by the very wife he had so foolishly underestimated. Jacqueline stood incredibly tall, looking absolutely radiant under the glowing chandeliers, her sheer presence completely commanding the entire room. She had bravely endured terrible humiliation, crushing heartbreak, and ultimate betrayal. But right now, she was the only one in the room holding absolute power. And exactly as the thunderous applause swelled louder, she leaned in just close, enough for only Ambrose to hear her whispered words twisting like a jagged dagger in his ego. This is honestly just the beginning. By tomorrow morning, the entire world will know absolutely everything. The bright morning immediately following the Bright Futures Gala, the entire island of Manhattan buzzed wildly with only one massive headline. Absolutely every single major newspaper, every trendy online magazine, and every scrolling social media feed carried the exact same striking image: Jacqueline Mitchell Blackwell, looking utterly radiant and powerful in deep emerald green, standing incredibly tall while a pale, sweaty Ambrose Blackwell visibly wilted in defeat. Right beside her, Queen Jacqueline claims her rightful throne, screamed one major front page headline: Betrayed wife destroys arrogant tycoon in public. Read a popular blog. And perhaps the most deeply satisfying of all, Ambrose Blackwell, the spectacular fall of a corrupt king. Jacqueline sat peacefully sipping her herbal tea in the quiet sanctuary of her new apartment, physically feeling her baby shifting gently and happily inside her. For once in her life, the absolute silence in her home wasn't suffocating or lonely. It was profoundly peaceful. She absolutely wasn't hiding in the dark anymore. She wasn't crying on the bathroom floor. She was completely, undeniably free. Her cell phone rang constantly on the counter. Desperate reporters were literally begging her for exclusive TV interviews. Massive charities were eagerly asking her to come and speak at their events. Wealthy corporate investors were calling to offer her massive business partnerships. Evelyn expertly screened absolutely all of them, acting as an impenetrable shield, keeping the chaotic noise safely at bay. You absolutely don't need to rush into anything right now, Evelyn said firmly. Over the phone. You've already spectacularly won the war. Now, you get to sit back and decide exactly how you want to write the next great chapter of your life. Meanwhile, Ambrose's massive, glittering empire collapsed around him exactly like a fragile house of cards in a hurricane. Wealthy investors rapidly withdrew their millions in funding. Frightened board members immediately resigned to save their own reputations. And Cassandra, true to her opportunistic nature, completely vanished from the public eye overnight, blocking his number. Even his own father, Harold Blackwell, issued a very rare, highly public press statement completely condemning his son's fraudulent actions, and shockingly, praising Jacqueline's immense public courage. Margaret sent a massive, beautiful bouquet of flowers to the apartment with a handwritten note that simply read, "You showed significantly more grace and dignity in one single night than Ambrose has shown in his entire miserable life." Ambrose himself completely retreated into a dark, pathetic silence. Once the golden, untouchable boy of Wall Street, he was now nothing but a tragic, toxic, cautionary tale. Hungry paparazzi occasionally caught pathetic glimpses of him, leaving cheap hotels entirely alone, looking heavily unshaven, his trademark arrogance completely stripped away. The arrogant man who had once cruelly sneered at her. "Without me, you're absolutely nothing," had rapidly become exactly that, nothing. For Jacqueline, the peaceful weeks that immediately followed the gala were not just about reveling in her revenge, but entirely about profound, personal renewal. She intentionally turned her entire focus inward, happily preparing for impending motherhood with a fierce, quiet strength she hadn't even known she possessed. She eagerly enrolled in supportive classes for new mothers. She enthusiastically met with top architects to finally reopen her long-dead dream of owning an interior design studio, and she happily reconnected with wonderful old friends she had been forced to abandon under Ambrose's toxic, controlling isolation. One sunny afternoon, as she was happily painting a beautiful, sprawling mural in the new nursery, a bright blue sky completely filled with colorful hot air, balloons drifting peacefully over rolling green hills, Evelyn walked into the room smiling a very wide smile. "The entire world desperately wants to hear your voice," Evelyn said, leaning against the doorframe. "They've already heard all about your deep pain. Now, it's officially time you let them hear your immense power." Jacqueline hesitated, holding a paint-covered brush. "Do you really, truly think anyone will actually listen to what I have to say?" Evelyn nodded emphatically. "They already are listening. What you bravely did at that gala wasn't just about destroying Ambrose. It was deeply about every single woman out there who's ever been violently silenced. It was about every single devoted wife who's been cruelly told she is absolutely nothing. You boldly stood up in the light, and they all clearly saw themselves reflected in you." So, Jacqueline finally agreed to speak out. Her very first major public speech took place at a massive, highly publicized women's empowerment conference. The wooden stage was incredibly simple, but the packed audience in the auditorium was vast and eager. As she stepped confidently up to the microphone podium, hundreds of cameras flashed brightly. But this time, she absolutely wasn't nervous. She wasn't standing there as Ambrose Blackwell's pathetic, quiet shadow. She was standing there entirely as herself. She spoke passionately of total betrayal, of massive personal sacrifice, of the agonizingly long nights she spent crying alone while Ambrose arrogantly flaunted his mistress to the world. She spoke honestly of the raw, paralyzing fear of raising a child entirely alone, and of the deep, crushing pain of being casually dismissed as nothing. And then, she spoke beautifully of the exact, defining moment she finally decided she would absolutely not stay silent anymore. Her clear voice grew significantly stronger, echoing powerfully across the massive hall as she declared, "I was repeatedly told by the man who was supposed to love me that I was weak. I was told that I was entirely powerless. But women are absolutely, fundamentally, never powerless. We literally carry life inside us. We hold together broken families. We carry entire, massive generations on our backs. And when we are brutally betrayed, we absolutely do not crumble into dust. We rise. I rose from the ashes. And so can every single one of you." The massive audience instantly erupted in deafening, thunderous applause. Thousands of women stood up from their seats with hot tears streaming from their eyes, clapping wildly, loudly shouting her name in solidarity. For the very first time in her entire life, Jacqueline felt not just victorious over her enemy, but profoundly, beautifully whole. Back home that quiet evening, she sat peacefully in the rocking chair in the nursery, looking at her now finished, beautiful mural. She gently rubbed her belly and whispered softly to her unborn child, "You will absolutely never, ever grow up seeing your mother as a broken woman. You will only see her standing incredibly strong. You will intimately know that true love is absolutely not about making painful sacrifices, but about mutual, deep respect. And you will always know that when this harsh life tries its hardest to completely crush you, you can always choose to rise." The beautiful day she finally gave birth to her baby was incredibly quiet, peaceful, and wonderfully intimate, surrounded only by the fierce loyalty of Evelyn and a few very close, trusted friends. Jacqueline joyfully welcomed her healthy, screaming son into the world. She held his tiny, warm body close to her chest, happy tears streaming endlessly down her exhausted face, whispering into his soft hair, "We're finally, truly free now." Major news outlets desperately tried to capture the highly anticipated moment, but Jacqueline politely and firmly declined absolutely all interviews. "This sacred moment is entirely ours," she said softly to Evelyn. "It's absolutely not theirs to consume." Several tense weeks later, a desperate, ruined Ambrose attempted one absolute, last, pathetic legal move. He tried aggressively to challenge the massive property transfers in federal court, but Evelyn was more than ready for him. The federal judge meticulously reviewed the hard evidence, his own authorized digital signatures, his highly illegal, fraudulent offshore transfers, and the audio recordings, and ruled swiftly and decisively in Jacqueline's total favor. Ambrose completely, legally lost absolutely everything. As the heavy wooden gavel struck the block with a final bang, Jacqueline didn't even bother to turn her head to look at him. She absolutely didn't need to. The pathetic, broken man who had once ruthlessly controlled every aspect of her life, was now completely, utterly irrelevant to her future. Peaceful months rapidly passed, and Jacqueline's highly anticipated design studio finally opened its doors in a massive, bright, sunlit corner of downtown Manhattan. The elegant, minimalist sign above the glass door read simply, Mitchell Interiors. Wealthy, eager clients practically poured through the doors, incredibly eager to work with the brilliant woman who had rapidly become a global symbol of feminine strength and resilience. Her new business boomed massively, not because of the lingering scent of tabloid scandal, but entirely because of her raw, undeniable talent. It was a profound talent she had once foolishly sacrificed for a man. Now finally, beautifully free to flourish and grow. Everywhere she walked in the city, people respectfully stopped her on the street. Some women whispered a tearful thank you as they passed by. Others nervously asked her for life advice. Many people simply smiled warmly at her. She had successfully become infinitely more than just the discarded wife of a disgraced corporate tycoon. She had powerfully become a global icon of absolute resilience. One crisp, beautiful evening, as she proudly locked the glass doors of her studio and stepped out into the cool night air, Evelyn joined her on the sidewalk. They stood together in comfortable silence and looked out at the glittering city skyline, the exact same bright lights that had once seemed so incredibly cold and unforgiving to a broken girl. You really did it, Evelyn said incredibly softly, a rare smile on her face. Jacqueline shook her head slowly, looking at her friend. No, we did it. Every single woman who's ever been violently silenced. Every single devoted mother who's ever been callously abandoned. This absolutely wasn't just my personal victory. It was a massive victory for all of them, too. Evelyn smiled a knowing smile. And what about Ambrose? Jacqueline gently shook her head, her facial expression completely calm and unbothered. Ambrose is just a very dark, incredibly boring chapter that I've permanently closed. My beautiful story absolutely isn't about him anymore. It's entirely about me. It's about my wonderful son. And it's about the incredible, peaceful life we're actively building together. They walked side by side in comfortable silence for a long moment. The massive city pulsing vibrantly and beautifully around them. Jacqueline could physically feel the heavy, suffocating weight of her dark past completely lift off her shoulders, entirely replaced by a brilliant, endless future she had boldly written all by herself. And as she looked proudly up at the towering, illuminated skyline, she whispered the two incredibly powerful words that had successfully carried her safely through the darkest storm of her life. We rise. And with those final words, the dark chapter of Jacqueline's life officially closed forever. It didn't end in pathetic defeat, and it certainly didn't end in toxic bitterness. It ended in spectacular, undeniable triumph. It was a massive, ringing reminder to every single person watching that absolutely no amount of betrayal No level of public humiliation, and no depth of heartbreak can ever truly silence a strong woman who firmly decides that she is finally going to rise. So, my wonderful friends, that is exactly how this incredible story finally closes today. If you're still sitting here with me, listening until this very final moment, it must mean that something deep inside this powerful journey has truly touched your own heart in a very personal, meaningful way. Maybe you have intimately known the agonizing sting of betrayal. Maybe you have known the suffocating weight of being forced into silence. Or maybe you have just quietly carried a deep, hidden pain inside your chest that is felt entirely too heavy to carry for far too long. And if any of that is true for you, I want you to take a massive, deep breath right now and hear this absolute truth. You are infinitely stronger than you think you are. What Jacqueline bravely showed us today is absolutely not just entertaining drama. It is profound truth. This chaotic life will eventually test you. Selfish people will inevitably disappoint and hurt you. But as the brilliant Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once profoundly wrote, you have power over your own mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find immense strength. She honestly thought she was completely powerless and trapped. But the exact moment she bravely chose her own dignity over her paralyzing fear, absolutely, everything in her world miraculously changed. That absolutely isn't just her fictional story. That can easily be your true story, too. The great philosopher Epictetus wisely taught us, it's not what happens to you, but exactly how you react to it that truly matters. Jacqueline easily could have just stayed broken on the nursery floor. But she didn't. She powerfully rose up, and in her magnificent rising, she graciously gave all of us a clear mirror to remember that even when this brutal life feels like it is entirely stacked against us, we still always possess a fundamental choice. We have a powerful choice to rise, to heal our wounds, and to bravely rewrite our own story. So maybe, just maybe, this epic story isn't really about a man named Ambrose at all. Maybe it is entirely about you. It's about the dark, terrifying storms you've bravely walked through in your life. It's about the incredibly long nights you honestly thought you couldn't make it through, and the bright, hopeful mornings you still managed to rise anyway. That is exactly what this story is truly about, absolute, undeniable resilience. If this powerful story touched your soul tonight, my dear friends, then please, do not just keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who needs it. Leave a massive like on this video, so I know it truly reached you. And if you desperately want more incredible stories that will constantly remind you of your own hidden strength, then please, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with us. Because together, we are absolutely not just watching entertaining drama. We are actively learning exactly how to rise again, and again, and again.